Hi! If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, nice to see you again. Today I wanted to start a new series on this channel focusing more on plant profiles and plant care. I sort of do this already in my plant haul videos, but I find that a lot of information gets left out, so I wanted to make videos focusing on specific plants, and that way I can give more in-depth plant care info. Now, I can't, or rather, I don't want to give advice and care tips on plants I've never owned nor cared for before. I'm only doing this for plants that I currently own and feel like are thriving. And even then, there's so many things and factors that go into plant care. We all live in different states, different countries, different environments, different climates that what works for me may not work for you. So you should take whatever I say here with a grain of salt. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the Philodendron Burle Marx Variegata. I've had this plant for a little over a year now, and I featured this in a previous plant haul video, which I'm going to show you a clip of right now. Up next is a Philodendron Burle Marx Variegata, and I got this from the Green Plant, Arizona. I just love plants with yellowish variegation, and I know this doesn't look like much considering it only has 3 leaves, but a bigger specimen looks absolutely stunning. It did have 6 leaves at one point, but I had to cut some off because they got sunburned. It started out with 2 leaves, so I can say this plant is a fast grower. It is a climbing type of philodendron, and I do plan on cutting this back once it gets bigger just to keep it more compact and bushy. Like I mentioned earlier, most philodendrons are easy to care for, this one included, and I know most people think twice about spending money on rare plants, but more often than not, you won't have a hard time caring for philodendrons. They are pretty easy to keep happy. The only thing you really do have to get right is the lighting when it comes to these variegated types, just to encourage better color. This specific plant is pretty resilient in terms of watering as well. It can take sporadic and irregular watering, just don't overdo it. Obviously, if you're spending money on a plant, you want to make sure that you can care for it properly. This plant seems to be very happy. I really do love this plant, and I can't wait for it to get bigger. Everything I said in the clip I showed you, I still find to be true today. This plant, it grew quite a bit, as you can see, but I would still consider my plant to be on the smaller side. I'll get into plant care in a bit, but I want to give you some info on this plant first. So once again, this is a Philodendron Burle Marx Variegata, and it is named after Roberto Burle Marx, who was a Brazilian landscape architect, and this plant is actually native to the tropical jungles of Brazil. It is a climbing philodendron, and in its native environment, you would see it wrapped around tree trunks and climbing up trees and structures. My plant doesn't have it, but some plants have really long aerial roots which they use to attach themselves to trees. And when you give this plant something to climb, it can get pretty tall. This plant has heart-shaped narrow leaves with yellowish variegation, and the leaves can get pretty big as well as the plant matures. This is one of the newer leaves, and look at how big it is compared to, let's say, this leaf right here, which is one of the original leaves. Like I mentioned, it is a climbing philodendron and it grows extremely fast. And if you don't keep this plant in check, it can get pretty leggy. Personally, I don't like how that looks, and I try to keep my plant looking bushy. And to achieve that, you just have to prune it back once in a while. My plant, however, ended up looking bushy by accident. If you look at the clip from when I first got this plant, you would notice that there was quite a bit of stem sticking out the soil before leaves started shooting out. And that's with the roots already hitting the bottom of the pot. It was quite leggy, and I didn't really like how it looked, but I kept it that way for a bit. And at some point, I actually neglected this plant. But it kept producing new growth and roots started coming out the pot. And I don't know what came over me, but I actually chopped this plant. And I'm gonna be completely honest, I was horrified because I spent quite a bit on this plant. But I chopped off majority of the roots and left maybe 2 inches of stem in. And then I just stuck that in water to root some more. And when it rooted, 2 months later, I chopped off the original roots I left in and I managed to shorten the stem by a significant amount. And now it sits nicely in the pot. And you're probably going, so Kat, what's the point of that story? The point is, this plant can take a lot. It's very resilient. Dare I say, it's almost impossible to kill. And that may be a little too much, but this plant can actually really take a beating. But back to the original point, how did that make my plant bushy? Because I rooted this plant again and it produced quite a bit of roots in a short amount of time, it decided to put out new growth points, which you normally achieve by cutting back the plant. But in this case, it decided to do that on its own. It only had one growth point at that time and way more roots than necessary. So I decided to push out new growth points. And now I have a bushy plant. I never really bothered to count how many growth points there are, but at one point it was pushing out 3 leaves at a time. Okay, enough of the backstory. Let's get into plant care. I'll be very honest with you. I don't really do much. It's a low maintenance plant, and like I mentioned way earlier, I actually consider my plant to be on the smaller side. I've seen massive ones, and I think it comes down to the fact that this plant, or my plant, is not being grown in optimal conditions. In fact, I'd say it actually gets the bare minimum. When you first get this plant, especially if it only comes with 2 or 3 leaves, it might take a while before you see a significant amount of growth. It is going to take its time acclimating, but once it gets going, it really gets going, and it's going to constantly be putting out new leaves. At that point, you're going to want to give it some form of support or something to climb on. In a couple of months, I'm actually going to give this plant a pull because it is getting a little heavy. Fortunately, it is growing outwards instead of upwards, which I do prefer, but this philodendron is a very prolific grower. Now, I find that the health of this plant relies heavily on just 2 things: lighting and watering. So let's talk about lighting first. This plant can survive in low light situations. It won't die, but it probably wouldn't look great either. It's also not meant to get direct sun. You can scorch the leaves, and I've had sunburnt leaves just from grow lights alone. So what does this plant need? It needs bright, indirect light. And I know a lot of guides say this, and a lot of people are still confused by what that means, but it literally just means that. Give it a lot of bright light, but don't let the sun directly hit it. I live in an apartment, and it really doesn't get enough light, so I've had this plant growing under grow lights since I got it, and I don't really like telling people how to use their grow lights or how far away to keep it from the plant because there are so many different kinds of grow lights. When I first got this plant, it was sitting a foot below the grow lights and it still managed to get sunburned. But now it's sitting maybe 2 inches away from the light and it's doing extremely well. That just goes to show that plants need proper acclimation, and when you're using grow lights, you should really experiment to see what works for your plant. And I'm telling you this because I wanted to show you that you can have a beautiful, healthy plant even if you live in an apartment that doesn't get enough light. You just have to find what works for your plant. Lighting is very important when you have a variegated plant to help it maintain its variegation, but I don't think giving it more light will necessarily make it more variegated. At some point, you're just gonna end up bleaching and burning the leaves. And what I mean by that is, I've had this plant sitting in the same spot since I got it, under the same grow lights, at the same distance for more than half a year now, and the leaves still go through cycles of being extremely variegated and just being completely green. Of course, some plants are just naturally more variegated than others, and those will have no problem constantly pushing out yellow leaves. And at that point, bright light is only necessary to maintain it. Personally, I don't really do much to encourage variegation. I tend to shoot for a 50-50 ratio, which means 50% variegated leaves and 50% green. I find that it makes for a more stable plant and it helps it grow a lot faster. And personally, I've never had a leaf fall off since I rerouted this plant. Variegation is a tricky topic and there's a lot to be said about it, but I won't dive too deep into that subject in this video. However, I will say that whether or not you're trying to encourage more variegation, your plant's health should always come first. And while heavily variegated plants are so pretty to look at, and I find myself looking at photos of them all the time, they do have a harder time sustaining themselves. If you want me to make a separate video on just variegation, let me know in the comments down below. And with that, let's move on to watering. Watering is a very tricky subject, and I feel like I don't often see it being talked about the way it should be. When I first started out with plants, watering in general was very confusing. I did everything from having a watering schedule to using a moisture meter to sticking my finger in the soil. And now looking back, I'm wondering why no one ever talked about soil in conjunction with watering. The soil or potting medium you use will dictate how you should be watering your plants. You need to understand how your potting medium holds water. The environment you're in also plays a factor. Is it dry or humid where you are? Because that will dictate how long your potting medium will stay wet. Generally speaking, this philodendron prefers moist soil. For me, keeping the soil moist means watering this plant a little bit every day. I live in a very hot and dry area, and my potting medium tends to dry out faster because of this. It may not be the same for you, and that's why it's important to understand how your potting medium works and how your environment plays a huge role in dictating how you should be watering your plants. I tend to keep my plant on the more wet side rather than dry, only because I rerouted this in water and it got used to having more water than normal. And that's another point I wanted to bring up. Watering changes based on how your plant has acclimated. If you have a plant that's thriving while drying out in between waterings, don't feel bad just because all the guides will tell you you need to keep the soil moist. Plants can acclimate and adapt differently, and I feel like we don't give them enough credit for that. Now you're probably wondering about temperature and humidity. For temperature, as long as you don't let this sit anywhere that gets below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you should be good. If you're comfortable, then your plant is as well. As for humidity, most guides will tell you this plant prefers high humidity levels. When I first got this plant, I had it quarantined in our spare bathroom with a humidifier, and it got on average 60 to 70%. Now it's sitting on a shelf where it would sometimes hit 50, but more often than not, it stays in the 40s. And I can confidently tell you it will do just fine in lower humidity levels. It may not grow as fast, but you won't have any issues with leaves browning or leaves not unfurling properly. Of course, your plant would appreciate higher humidity, but if you can't provide it that, don't sweat it, your plant will be just fine. As for fertilizer, I find that it doesn't really need it. It will grow faster if you feed it, but it can live without it. To be honest, I've only fertilized this plant twice for the entire time I've had it, and I just used fish fertilizer at half the recommended dosage. But yeah, from this point on, I'm gonna try fertilizing it monthly to see if it changes anything. and I'll probably make a video down the line if there's a significant difference. And I think that's about it when it comes to general care for this plant. I know I talked about a lot, but if you still have any questions, leave them down in the comments below or tweet me and I'll be sure to answer them. If you'd like to see more of my plants and my pets, you can head on over to Instagram. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a like. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on new videos. Thank you for dropping by and I'll see you soon. Bye.